much for joining us for our second Naturalist 101 of 2024. This is the first in a new series that we're doing here with 100 Miles. It is a tour of the coast. Now that we are back to reality, or a new reality, we are getting back to our roots and focusing on all these places along our coast that we maybe haven't visited before or haven't been to in a while, and just getting a better knowledge of all of those. And so tonight we are starting with Sapelo Island, and besides myself tonight, again, I'm Stephanie, I'm the education coordinator here at 100 Miles, but also we're joined by Jazz Watts. He is our justice strategist and also a Sapelo descendant. So I'm going to let him introduce his, the tag team tonight.
So yeah, we're tag teaming, and so I've been with 100 Miles a little over, I guess, 2 years now, and so they had already been doing these programs that come into Sapelo, and so I'm kind of tag teaming with Stephanie. She's done a lot of the heavy lifting, so I'm grateful to be able to partner with her on this. Yes, you're right. So it's absolutely right. I want to take a few moments of silence just for a couple of things. One, to acknowledge Ahmaud Arbery, who was a Sapelo descendant, and it was 4 years to the day on the 23rd of this month of his August 19th. So when I'm talking about Sapelo, and we're talking about his history, and we're talking about his people, we're also talking about him because he is now one of our ancestors. And I want people to always just kind of be considering and thinking of that too, and thinking of his family as well, and everyone, and all of us are connected. And I also want to acknowledge the weeping time, which 1859, March 2nd through the 3rd, is when we had which we now discover the second largest sale of human beings, of African peoples. In Savannah, and those people came from Butler Island, from St. Thomas, and they were sold from the racetrack in Savannah. All these things are so close, and they're all connected. And I think that as we talk about the history of the island, and Stephanie was talking about the ecology, and history, and this is kind of a broad brush, because we could do a whole series when we're talking about all of these spaces. But I think that we always need to consider and think about the fact that when we're talking about the history of these spaces, whether it's Sapelo, whether it's Butler, whether it's Harris Neck, whether it's Fusky, whether it's Hilton Head, we also need to be thinking about there were human beings, that were enslaved in these places, that actually built the infrastructure of these places through forced labor, and that should always be considered and a part of the history and a part of the story. And it's a history that belongs to all of us. So that's in this room. So I just want to, just take a moment to have silence just for
Very basic here for the beginning. Just to orient yourselves to exactly where we're talking about on the Georgia coast. Sapelo kind of falls right in the middle of our 100-mile coastline. It is the 4th largest of our barrier islands here in Georgia. Okay, pop quiz time. What's our largest barrier island? Cumberland. So Cumberland is our largest, followed by St. Clement. Got a little hair in my mouth. And Sapelo, from an aerial look, is actually it's made up of actually more than one island. If you look carefully, there's a river here, and this is Blackbeard. So it is a mass of it, and there's also Cabrera Island. So some of our islands here in Georgia, including St. Simon's, are complexes of different islands. Our islands here on the coast are barrier islands. Those are islands that are made of sand and are constantly reshaping and moving with the tides, the wind, the waves, lots of different affecting of these. So these are islands that are not meant to stay static. These are islands that change, and that is with the people, the ecology, it's all moving and shaping. So there's a lot of different aspects that go into the moving and shaping of Sapelo. So we are going to go to the earliest presence of humans on our coast, and our sea islands have the earliest human remains, or not remains, but artifacts that are found here. So there are two different things, and actually I wish I should just redone these slides. So the earliest artifacts of humans inhabiting Sapelo Island are found in these shell rings. These shell rings date over 4,000 years ago. They date pre-pyramids. And so these rings are a culture that we don't have a name for because they are pre-Mississippian, pre-woodland indigenous peoples, the islands. And there were 3 shell rings that we know of that were here on the island. These are remnants, and actually a dig out of one that is still here. So there is a lot of dating and work that's done, but there's still so much information we don't know about these early settlements. But we do think they did live in part of them. We do also think they moved around, came to the island for food, and the abundance of resources there. We do think that the other shell rings might have been used also for ceremonies in different times of the year. But again, a lot of this is what archaeologists are telling us, and there's still so much work to be done on it. But we do know there are shell rings found on our coast as well as South Carolina and in the Mississippi Gulf region as well. So, but these are the early signs of humans on this end of our country.
Yes, we are.
And then we did also have other more recent that when the Europeans came over, they interacted with other cultures. There are the Timucuans, which again was not their name, was a name that was given to them. Later the Wali was the more established. We do believe they had settlement on Sapelo and Keenan Fields. There's a lot of work being done with archaeologists out there trying to exactly locate all of the different parts of that. These pictures, again, are European depictions of the Walis that were living on the island. So again, they're European influenced pictures, but what we have of that. And these people traded with the other islands. They were all over, and then later on merged in with the Creek that were also found along our coastline here, which is a larger chiefdom made up of smaller tribes. The earliest European influence was the Spanish, which is similar. All of our islands kind of have a similar history in the fact that the Spanish were the first, and the Spanish came and built missions. They came with the goal of converting the Native Americans to Christianity, and they all went slightly different on it. But this is also where we get the first word Zapala, which is then changed into Sapelo. And this origin is actually from a Native American word. But again, Englishized, Spanishized, this pronunciation has changed. So there was a mission on Sapelo, and these are old pictures of doing a telemetry. The stuff that goes into the ground to try to find and locate those missions out on Sapelo. The next biggest player to have influence on Sapelo is Mary Musgrove. Mary Musgrove was the niece of a chief that was set up along what was then early Georgia. She worked as a trader, and when James Oglethorpe first came here to set up the colony, he actually hired her to help as a translator and interpreter and a guide as he was exploring the coast of Georgia and setting up his forts and the colonies that he did here. So Mary Musgrove was a married last name, was Musgrove, and she actually was married 3 times, which is, and part of that is because as a female in Georgia, once this colony started, she couldn't keep her land when her husband died, and so she got married so she wouldn't lose her land. But she was also gifted by a chieftain 3 islands on our coast, and this is why she's important to tonight's lecture. She was gifted Ossabaw, St. Catharines, and Sapelo at one point. However, the British government did not see her as being able to own those islands. So she fought for her rights to own those. She actually went over to England with a whole bunch of Creek supporters to try to rally around it. In the end, after a long period of time, after they sold islands out from under her, she was given St. Catharines at one point. But again, a woman almost owned 3 of our islands at the very beginning.
And I think I want to add too is that this whole idea of owning and selling land, I mean, just, really just thinking about that consideration, because you're talking about places that are actually essentially occupied by civilizations of people. So this entire, idea, and I think about even like, as Stephanie will kind of go on and you'll see like the several different owners of the island and everything else. This whole concept of like, that you can own ground, and you can just sell it and kind of do whatever you deem is quote unquote legal. But
Yeah.
okay.
After that part, we get into the plantation age on the island, and there were quite a few owners that passed hands. This is where you get down into the minutia of a lot of different land passing, but it's also, there are ruins that a lot of people who've been out to Sapelo have been up to, Chocolat, which is also a bad translation of a word. There is no chocolate there, but that's what it's known of. There were 5 French families that are established the biggest part of it. However, they got in fights and it broke up quite quickly, but there was passing of hands along the time on that. But this is the beginning of plantations and slaves coming over to the island. There was, and it wasn't just before, in the beginning, there was a lot of cattle and cotton. They did indigo, there was rice, there were lots of things tried out on the island. And this is also when the island transformed from its original native state, because first they cleared the land to remove the trees, to sell the timber off. Then there was this flattening of the land to prepare it for the growing of crops. And then even further on, when our next major plantation we're going to talk about, Thomas Spalding came out there, he also used his slave labor to try to drain this wetland areas in the center of it. So this is also a big time where the ecology in the land really started changing due to human impact.
Yeah, and I'll just add too, that when we think about, and there's this whole story about these Frenchmen who were, these, slave owners, and again, we're talking about people who owned other, human beings, and when you think about just what Stephanie was talking about, the clearing of the land, and people did this by hand. There's literally a song and dance, a bucket book that's based on, people actually dying in fields, or dying from, snake bites and things of that nature. So this is, brutal, hard work, So, for me, when I, go and I, visit, this space or look at these spaces, I just think to myself what it must have been like, for all of these people who could see the water but could not go home. That were, in this space, that they were forced to work and didn't have a choice or didn't have, couldn't make those independent decisions. But I think, these are the things that should also remind us of the fact that we all don't come from the same lineage and the same spaces. And that, it goes far past, the plantation era. She'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the contemporary, when we get into Jim Crow and things like that. But just to add just a little.
So for our viewers at home, could you stand over here?
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I'm gonna stand here, we'll just change it. So,
Okay.
does that work?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, if y'all are like
Technical.
right there.
Closer.
Yeah,
Okay.
even closer.
It's
Probably should turn it the other way.
I get in trouble all the time. But anyway, that's another story. A lot of us get. There's all kind of names on that wall.
So this name, if you live in the South, this part, this name, his name is like his name is everywhere. Thomas Spalding was actually born on St. Simon's at Fort Frederica. His mother was a Highlander who came down in that initials there. He ended up buying land on Sapelo in 1802, but he was also gifted land from his father-in-law, so he also gained land that way. But he had, at the height of it, had over 400 slaves on Sapelo and in Darien that were cultivating cotton, indigo, and sugar. He first came to wealth with sugar. Here you're actually seeing his sugar mill down here on the bottom. The remnants of it are still by Long Tabby on Sapelo Island. He actually lucked out in one way because sugar was expensive and most sugar was imported by the British to the colonies at that point, or country, early country. But there was the War of 1812 and embargo put on British sugar. So his sugar was able to sell at a great price. Also friends with John Cooper, who owned a large plantation on Simon's Island and helped cultivate seeds and creating the long staple cotton, which was a premium cotton that grew very well on our sea islands here, and able to cultivate that on the island, which also brought in quite a lot of money for him as a tea. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I forget what the amount or the quote-unquote financial gain was, but it was like equivalent today, I think it would have been in the billions. And if you can imagine having all these human beings that were out in these fields that were picking, cotton with their hands and sugar cane and just and rice and all these different crops. And I always, again say, this enterprise of, enslaving, people. But if you looked in history books and you looked up Thomas Spalding, you would see, is that better? Because they can't. Yeah, if you looked it up, you would see that he's kind of seen as this entrepreneurial, enterprising, individual and everything else, and he gets all this credit for tabby and all these other things, that were prominent in Africa already before. And, to me, I'm like, well, people just don't want to talk about, well, this is a slave owner. He was a person who, the moral compass wasn't there and subjugated human beings. But somehow we kind of live in a space where it's like, but he kind of took care of them. And it's like, no. They took care of themselves. And that's what this system was, and that's who this person was. And the people who have the power are the people who get to write the narratives, of these stories that we see. But I always say to people, well, think about the bigger picture of things when you're considering, the impact of what, this really means. And I'm assuming this was probably a happy day for him. I think that's probably him smiling.
That's the biggest joke. Is like, can't you find us a picture of him smiling?
Right. It's the only picture of this person, and he died, I think, right before.
Yeah, he has. Yes, he passed before the start of the Civil War.
Right.
But he was also wanting to stay within the Union. He was against the idea of succeeding. So, and it might be because most of his children didn't make it to adulthood.
Right.
He had 16 kids. I think only 5 made it to adulthood.
Yeah, and so Bilali Muhammad is a central figure in, when you talk about Sapelo, when you talk about Islam in America, he is synonymous with it. Is the, kind of the first acknowledgement of, the practice of the religion itself. But in that book that you see right there is a manuscript is known as the Bilali document. It's housed at the University of Georgia, and I think that they think that it was written around 1859, maybe a few years before his passing. We believe that he was captured and sold as a teenager in Timbo in Guinea, and then. Of course, we all understand what, the transatlantic slave trade, but also the Middle Passage. That's the other part of all of this equation that people don't think about, the fact that there were millions of people that were enslaved and chained in these ships that did not make it, through this brutal Middle Passage. And he would survive that and would be first enslaved in Karakou, in the Bahamas, and eventually in 1802, Spalding would purchase Bilali Muhammad, along with his wife Phoebe and daughters that would come with him, and he would come to Sapelo Island, where he would kind of rise, in a sense, to the top of this hierarchy of a plantation system, and become a driver, or quote unquote, responsible for everything that happens on the plantation. But the other side of it, I always think to myself, this is a man who is making the best of the situation that he was in, and trying to, in a sense, take care of those that were his people. But, what is significant to me too is, the religious faith that he had, that the document that is to this day, that we all know about is these religious writings, of him remembering, who he was, where he was from. And I think that is powerful for someone to go through what he had gone through, and what his descendants, and I'm one of the direct descendants, but of the 44 families that are on Sapelo from him. That is powerful to me. How many people, would survive, something like that, and live through that. And the people that are today that are on the island, we are the direct descendants of that lineage. And for me, that is the reason why it is so important for not only all of you to know, but to understand. That is why we must, protect the culture, protect the people, and protect the land.
Yes.
And Freedman community. So I was actually just talking to one of my cousins, and she was telling me that, yes, that's your
That's my grandmother.
that is your grandfather. That's my Marcella. But yeah, that's her grandfather on the wagon right there, Mr. Julius Bailey. And there were 15 different communities, behavior. Raccoon Bluff was one, Longer Landing, Johnson Hammock. There were a number, of communities. This is a picture of Raccoon Bluff Church that was built after a hurricane, I think, was it 1898? I believe, and the wood washed up on the shore, and they built,
That's right.
they built this church. And of course, this is behavior cemetery. So there were several, communities, 15 total throughout, the entire island. And we're going to talk a little bit more how all of a sudden you end up with just one.
So these were established after the Civil War. Originally, Sherman had said to give the land back. Obviously, that was reversed the next year, but we still had many of the former enslaved people come and serve these communities.
Right, because once, Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson rescinds the order, and then, all of a sudden you're into kind of this reconstruction and this, sharecropping, system in a sense. But, the other thing about it too is that in the South, you also had the caste system, right? So, so you would have these enslaved people, and you give them kind of like, they needed to finish a certain amount of work by a certain amount of time, or there'd be consequences or punishments and things like that. And so settlements did come out of, those after the war. People, settled in the spaces where they were, and farmed and worked that land because, rightfully, was theirs.
So from that, we get to the Gilded Age down here on our coast. This is the time where many of our islands were looked at as winter retreats from northern industrialists looking to escape those brutal winters. And Howard Coffin was no exception to that rule. He first came down in our islands, not only were they nice winter retreats, they were hunting. Hunting was a big sport of all of these. And so Howard Coffin, a huge hunter, did come down here, hunted one year, and ended up buying a large percentage of Sapelo the year after. He made his money by being the VP of the Hudson Motor Company. So he's from Detroit, Michigan. The joke is always that it's called the Hudson Motor Company, not the Coffin Motor Company, because he wants to drive out a coffin. But his key to the success of that company was the fact that he's considered the father of standardization. So he was the first person to make the same parks that could go in multiple vehicles instead of individual parks. So making that process a lot faster and streamlined. So that's where it came from. He is also the one who took the South End house, the big house, and we'll have a picture of that later, but he took that house, he renovated it to what we now consider the Reynolds Mansion. Those of you who are out there, he's really the one who did most of the work on it. He just wasn't the last owner of it, so he doesn't get as much credit. This is his wife Matilda, and they never had any children, but another big endeavor he did that connects back down here is the fact that he built the cloister on Sea Island. So those of you who have been to both of these homes, there are some similarities in design and all of that. He ended up, Matilda died, he had some falling outs, the crash happened, he lost a lot of his money, he ended up selling Sapelo, and he moved over to Sea Island. He did pass away on Sea Island, but his grave and Matilda's graves are in Christchurch in a very prominent location. So you can visit his grave on St. Simon's Island that way.
How did he come to own Sapelo?
Well, there were several
Yeah.
owners.
Yeah, there were several.
Patrick McKay, I mean, I think there were 3 or 4 that were even before him. So, I think that, like Howard Coffin is among, just like R.J. Reynolds Jr., which will be next, among just like a group of these people who just are extremely wealthy from, whether it's Reynolds with tobacco and also just kind of the exploitation of labor, of people that didn't have power, right? And
Coffin also came down and opened a cannery on Sapelo and employed many of the residents of the island there too. So,
and just thinking about like you have an island where people would need to be employed, in some way or in some form, right? Because otherwise you gotta leave and then you gotta come back. So you just kind of, to me, I always say, and I was gonna wait until the next slide, is that, Coffin and Reynolds are kind of like this continuation of this system that was already, in place. And maybe just because the law changed and, there was this abolishment of enslavement doesn't mean that these people didn't kind of rule these spaces in the same manner, to a certain extent.
After the crash, I mentioned that Coffin lost a lot of his wealth, and so he sold his holdings of Sapelo as well as his yacht to R.J. Reynolds Jr., which Jess just mentioned is a tobacco heir. So his father started the Reynolds Tobacco Company. He was an interesting character. I'm sure we've all heard stories of his exploits. He's pretty much a playboy. He didn't really have a full-time job. He kind of sailed around in his yacht on there. He did, though, during World War II, join the Navy. It was part of the Pacific Fleet, and so I have always been told by people that even until his death he had a full Navy uniform that fit him for pictures. For that he was married 4 times. Divorced, but actually he was married 5 times to 4 women because his divorce didn't go through the one time, so he had to remarry the last one. On that he did invest in a lot of industry. He was a pilot as well. He invested in the beginning of Delta. He built the airfield that is on, or currently still on, Sapelo. He also did cattle, grew cattle and had a huge cattle dairy, which will come into play later on in his story. He also did employ many of the residents out there, which is a different part of the story, is it?
Yeah, no, so, it was, with R.J. Reynolds Jr., where you see, all of these communities, and keep in mind when we're talking about, even in a sense like Stephanie's talking about employment, it's the people that are, in the space, on the island, the descendants of those that were enslaved that are doing a lot of that labor. And so, he wants to create this preserve, this wildlife preserve, and, basically there is a forcing people in all these different communities to centralize them into what is, Hummock now. And there's all kinds of stories that, and even documents that exist that literally say that, the goal was to, push people into this one spot and just move them off of their land. And I think that is what is, significant to this day. So when and later on, I'll be, talking about what is going on right now, is in a sense a repetition of the history of what, continues to happen. And I always say, just because the law may say that it's legal to do it, doesn't mean that it's legal to do it. And then when you live in a space where someone has all the power, really, like he owns the space, if you didn't, do what he says or get along with him, guess what? Now you don't have a job. So now you gotta, leave the island. So, to have that immense type of power. And I always say historically, when you're talking about people can be both, right? So he could have events at, the mansion, for families, for Christmas, and for Thanksgiving, and all those things, and still be taking land from people. So the same person can be doing those things. And so sometimes when people talk about, Reynolds will talk about some of the, good things that he did. And I'll just, or they say he did this and he did that. And I'll go, okay, it's not that I'm not saying that he didn't do those things, but that doesn't take away from the fact that he also did these things too. And we should acknowledge and recognize that both things can be true. So, but he really represents the massive consolidation and forcing of people off of their land into where they are today.
Just to give a little more context, when we have talked about all of these homes, there is what is now known as the Reynolds Mansion, but these are all other names of it. This first is a rendering drawing that was done by Thomas Spalding's granddaughter later in her life. So it's the best representative of what we think of the home that Thomas Spalding built on Sapelo. And it was also written that it was supposed to look like or reminiscence of Monticello, was where he took inspiration from. This is a picture of what it looked like 10 years or so after the Civil War, before Coffin came in this is actually before Coffin. So it was renovated slightly for a hunting lodge. That's when Coffin bought it and then redid the house. And then this picture is current of like 7 years ago of what the house currently looks like. The current state of the house is owned by the Park System of Georgia, and it's actually a lodge, and you can rent it out for all of your family and friends. And you can stay there, and it includes all of your meals. So it's currently run by the state of Georgia, but these are the cycle of what has happened to the home. So besides having the main home, Coffin first started by building additional canneries and other outbuildings on the land. He had other homes built up at Chocolate. Coffin redid the dairy barn that we saw in that picture. He built, brought in another home there. Reynolds came in, he added even more. Reynolds just did everything up another level. He built additional homes. He also expanded what is now known as Ugami. At that time, it was a dairy facility. And I'm cheating and looking at the date. 1953, with the help of Professor Dr. Eugene Oldham, they started what is now known as UGA's Marine Institute. It was where research was done within the marsh, focusing on ecology, and now this facility hosts doctoral students, visiting professors from over 100 institutions.
Sure.
Yeah.
Throughout the U.S.
Yeah, throughout the whole U.S. It's a fantastic place of research. They also host students to come down and do semesters there to do field work. Also, they do tons of teacher workshops, so it's become this incredible center of ecology of it. Dr. Eugene Oldham, a professor at UGA, is also known as the father of the new idea of ecology. He was the man who first decided, instead of looking at an individual organism and how it interacts, look at the whole ecosystem and how they all work together. So it was a new idea of what this ecology of what we now, or at least what I even studied when I was in college, of how we looked at the world around us. And so, and that institute was started in 1953. John Teal was also one of those. There's a great book, Portrait of an Island, that was written by John Teal about this time period.
And I would add too, just thinking about institutions like, the Marine Institute and even, Dr. Oldham's, there were just a slew of residents that, Gullah Geechee residents, in the communities that worked, in these spaces that worked, at these labs. But, those people weren't, given the opportunity for scholarship, or publication, or any of those things, because we recognize, what that time, would have been like. And I always say that, I've read some of his work and said, wow, that's amazing. Well, what would it have been like if you would have also kind of, tapped into the indigenous knowledge, of the people who know the land, who know the water, who know the space, but they were all employed, in that space. So, to me, when I think of the, accomplishments and the work that he's done, I would like to think that, probably a significant part of that was because of the people that were there working, in the space that took them to the spaces so that they could, I don't know, catch the right fish or study certain things, to learn about the waterways, because they wouldn't have known that. You would have had to have learned that from the community, from the people that were already there. So I feel like those people would have played a significant role. We'll never know what that is, but maybe we will one day.
So next is, after R.J. Reynolds Jr. died, we start to have the turnover of the land to the next steps. And this is also a common story on our coastline, is like what happened when these people who own these massive islands, what was their next step and what would the legacy be? So Sapelo was sold off in two major sections to the state of Georgia. The first being the north end, or the R.J. Reynolds Wildlife Management Area. And so this is an area now that is managed for the land. There are hunts that are done out there, but there is now no buildings or development done in this dark, light gray section of the island. And then later on, the second section of the gray was also sold off to the state of Georgia. That is where the Reynolds Mansion is. It's also right on the edge of where Uganny is, and so that is also part of a larger state park and the creation of the National Estuary Research Reserve. A lot of words. And this is a partnership with NOAA, so the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and Georgia DNR, that is doing studies within the marsh, and these are long-term ecological studies. So these are over long periods of time to monitor sea level rise and growth rate and water quality. All of these things are done within that green area on the island. And the only exception to all of that is that Hummock in the middle, where Reynolds had moved all of the people living there, is the only part that is not owned by the state of Georgia. That is part of McIntosh.
Yeah, and so there were I guess two major, you would call, transactions. I think the first one was in '67, and maybe the second one was in
69 and 76.
Oh, 69,
I have them on my
76.
sheet.
So, when I look at this map, I think about the fact that, there were 15 communities that spanned across this space, and now there's only, this one, and there are also folks that are in, families that still inhabit, Johnson home. And so, who decides, who gets to sell the land, or if it is right, or if it was done proper, or if it was done, legally right? Because, to me, I think about, all these spaces, and I mean, there's stories about, he just put electricity here. And said, oh, well, you want electricity, then you're gonna have to, do some type of deal or deal with me so that you can move, you can move here. And some people didn't even yield to that. And there were other stories of other ways that, people were essentially or eventually forced into this one space. And I think that when, it's such a tough thing, for me, because I look at like the Research Reserve and some of these agencies that do, when you're talking about good work and conservation type work, but the other side of it is, how did we get here? And we get here because, people were essentially forced, from their land, or forced into, selling their land in different ways, by different avenues, by different mechanisms, because, they didn't have that level of, of power that the people that, own the space, did. And I think you have the same type of discussion you could have about Harris Neck. You could have that same exact discussion, that, all of that land, and if you've ever seen, and you should, if you haven't seen it, the 1619 project, where they talk about, how the descendants of Harris Neck had their land taken. And then, and you have U.S. Fish and Wildlife who holds the land, and I've even heard some people say, well, if they had the land, and, they wouldn't, do with it, or they'd be abusive, or this and that. But I always say that when people were displaced from those areas, that's when you started having some significant issues. And of course, the catch-22 to all of this is that, if it's with the state, in a sense, that it doesn't look like it's going to get developed. So, so what does a future conversation look like? Sitting down with, descendants, of these ancestors who who did not agree to this, who had their land taken, and saying, what does reparations? I think that's when that conversation happens. What does that look like when we're talking about land? Because you don't grow any more land or grow any more dirt, right? So, but I think that's something that's, hopefully, that we can talk about in the future. Yeah, and this is just, how many people have been to Lula's? Oh my goodness. If you haven't been high on the hog, have nothing on the Lula's. I'm just telling you. She is an absolutely incredible person. Yes, so that's what we're talking about. An incredible, cook of Gullah Geechee and Gullah Geechee food, saltwater Geechee food. She is an absolutely wonderful person, and she'll tell you about what it was like when she was growing up on the island. What she remembers, what she recalls, and I just, I think, for me, and thinking about just all this is all it's like. I'm just thinking about, all of this, I didn't know. As I think that we should just all kind of consider and think about all of the history and why it is, so important for all of us, to fight, for Sapelo, to fight for the community of Hummock, because historically it has been through, the people have been through a lot. And I always think about the trauma, that my ancestors, have been through. And my cousin Mike always says, but we still here. He's like, the people are still here. So there's still opportunity to help support the people.
Well, we're going to talk about some of those people right now. Just to give you some people that don't always get talked about. So Katie Underwood was the last midwife on the island. So again, you're thinking about an island before there was a regular scheduled ferry going over there. These people lived off the land. These were people that lived in community. They shared their stuff. Well, and Miss Katie Underwood was the last midwife. And many of Katie's babies, as they're recalled today, are still alive and living in that community. And in honor of that, the newest of the ferries that work over there is named in her honor. That's why there's a beautiful white ferry here on the thing. But it is in honor of her legacy as the midwife on the island.
I just, I'm always growing up, I heard stories about her. She was my, grandaunt's grandmother, and she, represents, I think, everything that was good about being a good person. I mean, she could apparently have a baby on the south end, that she needed to walk miles, you know, to go deliver one baby and come on. I mean, that was the kind of person, you know, that she was. And that's the kind of, I think, lineage and generational power that we need to think about when we're thinking about the people, you know, of Sapelo and the people of Hummock and, you know, what we come from. People like Miss Katie Underwood, and then of course Cornelia Walker Bailey, which I'm sure how many people met Miss Cornelia? Yeah, you'll never forget that. She was just, and that is Marcella's aunt, and she was just an amazing person, an incredible, you know, spokesperson, you know, for the community. You don't, you know, get a lot of people like Miss Bailey, but, you know, the thing is that collectively, we do have the presence of those people. I feel like she is a part of all of us, you know, that are descendants, that is in the community. Her son runs an agricultural program, so they'll say our legacy herself, Maurice Bailey. He also has a business that he does tours, you know, as well, and he has opened this, you know, little bar. His dad has what we call the trunk, and you know, you want a little something to drink. Right. You want to say that? We're gonna have to edit that. Forget I said that. And that's her book, Dr. Buster and the Bully.
Yeah, the legacy of it. But we did want to point out two other
Yes.
authors that have written.
Michelle Johnson, Sapelo Island, Hummock, and just to, you know, give you some, you know, books that you can think about reading, to learn a little bit more about the island. And then Making Gullah, Sapelo Island with Race and the American Imagination, which is by Professor Dr. Melissa Cooper, who is also a descendant, and she is a professor at Rutgers University. And I think that is a great book too, because it really goes into like the political climate of, you know, all these things that are happening. So it just gives you a different, you know, a different perspective. I think a perspective that's more closely aligned with what people were experiencing, you know, at that time. And then Michelle Johnson, Sapelo Island song, she's really great.
Yeah, because this is the legacy part of it, and you kind of already mentioned the Red Pea.
Yeah. So the Red Pea Project. You can talk about that. And I actually brought some. Just some, and these are just some ones that I thought about that, you know, people, if you want to just, you know, read more about, you know, just kind of the racial, you know, dynamic of what's happening, you know, in the space. Like this is a good one from an Igbo Kadali, Pan-African Social Ecology. How many people know about Igbo landing? You know, right here on St. Simon's, this would be a good one. Oh, okay, a good one to read, and he's like, move over more. And of course, there wasn't a legal man, Sapelo Island, Hummock. This is a book by Jillian Hishaw, and she is an attorney that does a lot of land work. And it's like 50 state U.S. flags and their historic symbolism. And it's a great, not a long book, but it really talks about the history of enslavement in each of the states. And this is one that's called Systematic Land Theft, and it says the history of U.S. tactics in keeping tribal nations from reclaiming their land in the Black West. So these are just some great books that people can read, I think, contemporarily and right now today. And this is one that's called Meeting at the Table, African American Women Write on Race, Culture, and Community, and it's by Tina Hamza. And she is actually a local writer that's here on St. Simon's, and she's absolutely amazing as well. But I know we got sweetgrass baskets.
There you go. So we were just highlighting some of the idea is like what can be done, how can you revitalize a community? And so these were two of the big projects. So red peas originally came over with the enslaved people when they first came to Sapelo and have been growing over there. And so growing them and selling them to restaurants, every time I hear about it, they are sold out to high-end Atlanta restaurants and Savannah restaurants looking for those indigenous local foods.
Yeah. Let me tell y'all, this kind of work ain't for the weak. This is some serious work. And if you can imagine what it was like for people back then, I mean, just volunteering and working with, Maurice, and usually have, he has students that come and volunteer and work to help them, harvest the peas. But, I always think to myself too, with, all this heritage crop, whether it was peas, whether it was cotton, whether it was, cane, or rice, this was just significantly brutal work. So it's really neat that we still have a project like this. You want me to should I just hit it?
Oh, all you have to do is hit the arrow. There you go. You did it.
Right. How many people know Yvonne?
Tobacco wires.
Yeah.
If you don't know Yvonne Grover, then you want to get to know her.
I think those are her hands.
Those are probably her hands.
It's
Right there making
So,
baskets.
like,
Yeah, so the skill that was passed down for generations, obviously these were originally utilitarian, and obviously now they are an art form that is
Yes,
passed down
and
to
she is
generations.
constantly making baskets. She, I think, was honored for like the governor's honors, right? For, and one of her baskets was.
There's Arts Excellence Award.
Yeah, like
2
in
years ago.
President Obama's inauguration, I think that they had one of her baskets, and basket making, cast net making, quilt making are those traditions that are passed down for generations. And she was taught by Mr. Alan Green, who was really the last master basket maker. It was her, Dr. William Banks, and Jerome Dixon. Those were the main three, but she's absolutely amazing, and she's very easy to find. Yes.
Speaking of books, I think Yvonne also has a cookbook, doesn't she?
She does have a cookbook. Thank you. Sorry about that. I don't know what the title of it is, but she does have a cookbook.
It's a group book.
Okay. And she wrote it with, I think, Cornelia and maybe one other.
That's the end.
Oh, that is the end. Okay. So, there were a few things that I did want to mention, because I just want to kind of, talk about some of the things that are going on right now. And we know that there's a legal action that's going on between, McIntosh County and the community about the zoning on September 12th, 2023. Commissioners rezoned in a vote of 3-2 to have much larger houses, up to 3,000 square feet, and just as high, I think, like maybe 2.5 stories. And I guess what I want to say to people is that there is, there is a repeated legacy, to this. Back in 2012, there was an instance where property taxes were, up on some people as much as 1,000%. And there eventually would be a settlement, and some people got refunds, but then there was, another legal action that happened in 2015, and that was led by descendant Reginald Hall. And in that settlement, there was a settlement with both the state and the county, and that was about, basic services. And then all of a sudden, here we are again, in these legal battles. And what I would say to everyone that's sitting in the room is, this is happening in Sapelo, but this is also happening to a lot of other communities. St. Helena is facing, this challenge to their cultural protective overlay, because you have a developer who wants to build a golf course, on the island. And I always remember my dad used to tell me he was from St. Simon's, and what St. Simon's used to look like. And I always say, okay, when is enough, enough?
Right.
Can there be just some places where we consider those places sacred? Where those people are the descendants of people that have gone through immense suffering. And it's just, it seems to not be. So we are in the middle of, this fight, and we're doing two things. There is the legal, fight, which is being led by the Southern Property Law Center attorneys, and also Jason Carter's law firm, and the Southern Property Law Center attorneys were brought by Mr. Hall to the island. And then there's also the referendum. And so in the local McIntosh County paper, you can get, there's like a whole half a page where you can cut this thing out and you can send it to the Keep Sapelo BTPO box. So if you're a McIntosh County registered voter, or people that are McIntosh County registered voters, please tell them about this. And we, also have these petitions, and we're pretty close. We're only a few hundred more away. And what does that mean? What that means is that McIntosh County is saying to the commissioners that this is not the right way to do things. This is not acceptable. This is not, yes, Solo is with me. This is not how our local government should operate and represent us. And it will make a statement, and then of course, when we get the referendum, people still have to go to the polls. And my hope is that people will say to them, no, we're gonna do this the right way, and this is not the way to do it.
But thank you for everyone who has joined us online, and we hope to see you in another program soon.
Yeah,